Did you know that your muscles can only contract and shorten? To extend them, we must contract a different set of muscles in the opposite direction. Lesson is on the specifics of muscle fiber contraction. So, muscle contractions brought about by the action of two types of myofilaments known as actin and myosin. The arrangement and movements of these myofilaments allows them to slide past one another. Actin myofilaments are thin, consisting of two protein strands wrapped around each other. Myosin filaments are thick and comprised of bundles of myosin molecules. Each myosin molecule consists of two polypeptide chains wrapped around each other, and they have a bulbous head attached to a rod like tail. So these heads on the myosin molecules protrude from the thicker myosin filaments at a variety of intervals. To bring about muscle fiber contractions, the head of the myosin have to be attached to binding regions on the actin myofilaments. So the myosin heads bind onto the actin myofilaments. So here we can look at the actin myofilaments that are arranged with that two twisted strands on the top and bottom. And then we have the myosin filament in the center with those bulbous heads. So those bulbous heads are going to grab onto the actin filament as muscle contraction occurs. This is known as the sliding filament model. So contraction of the muscle fiber begins by the flexing of the heads of the myosin molecules backwards. So those myosin molecules are going to grab onto the actin and slide it backwards. Since the heads are attached to the actin molecules, the actin fibers are pulled along the myosin myofilaments. As the actin slides past the myosin in a step-by-step fashion, as more heads flex backwards. And the flexing of each myosin head requires a molecule of ATP, so it needs energy. So here we can see in pink, those myosin heads are gripping the actin myofilaments, and they're slowly moving it along that myosin myofilament. So they're pulling it along, allowing the muscle to contract from both ends. So the actin myofilaments are anchored at each end of the muscle cell, and the movement pulls the ends towards the center of the fiber. So we're contracting it from the ends towards the center of the muscle fiber. Actin and myosin myofilaments are arranged so that a pair of actin myofilaments slide inwards over the myosin from opposite ends of the muscle fiber. This shortens each muscle fiber and therefore the muscle as a whole. Now, this all takes energy in the form of ATP because the myosin heads need this to release from the actin proteins, and the whole process starts again as the myosin heads attach again and then pull the muscle fiber further along. When they're in the relaxed state, the myosin heads cannot bind to the actin molecules because the binding sites are blocked by another protein which is wrapped around the actin myofilaments. So this contraction can only occur in certain conditions. For the muscles to contract, calcium ions must bind with another protein called troponin. Now, when these calcium ions bind to the troponin, this complex joins with tropomyosin, and the tropomyosin is moved out of the way, exposing the myosin binding sites. So calcium must bind to another protein to expose the binding sites on the actin filaments. So without calcium, muscle contraction isn't possible. So here we have another description of the sliding filament model. So we can see calcium is that little yellow ball that's coming in and altering the binding site, allowing the myosin to bind on to the actin myofilament, pulling it along, allowing for muscle contraction. Okay. And ATP is that green ball that is being used up with every single contraction. This is why muscle contractions use energy. So step one, calcium attaches to the troponin tropomyosin, and then it rolls away, exposing the active site on the protein. So we can see this between the first picture and the second picture, where now calcium has binded, exposing the active site on the actin. Now, step two, the myosin cross bridges to attach to the active site on the actin, and then pulls back on the actin, sliding it towards the center of the muscle cell. Now a fresh ATP replaces the ADP plus P, or the used ATP, allowing the myosin and actin to detach. Energy from the splitting of the fresh ATP allows the repositioning of the myosin head. So every single movement of that myosin head needs a new ATP molecule. Now in step 4, which takes us back to step 1, calcium is going to bind onto that active site, exposing it for the myosin to attach, and then just continues as long as the calcium ions are going to be attached to the troponin, tropomyosin, and as long as muscle contraction needs to continue.